And let's get started. So hello, I know everybody who's in this meeting, so I probably don't need to introduce myself, but hi, I'm Teresa. I'm one of the assistant deans. And welcome to the inaugural talk of the new faculty lecture series for the 2022-2023 school year. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Tiffany Larson. She's a new addition to the Department of English. And the title of her talk is The Role of Curriculum and Assessment in Complex Adaptive Systems. And Dr. Larson is a teacher educator who is passionate about literacy and literacy education. She worked in secondary schools for 12 years as an English teacher and campus administrator before moving into higher education. In her work with students, she noticed that the oversized influence of standardized assessments failed to recognize the intricacies of teaching and learning or the personal nature of literacy development in adolescents. I'm sure that's true. Her teaching and research focuses on the role of literacy education in complex school systems. We'll go ahead and have Tiffany give her talk. At the end, we will open the floor for questions. You're welcome to unmute yourself and just ask. Or if you put something in the chat, I'll be keeping track of that or helping Tiffany keep track of that. Thanks for joining us, Tiffany.
Thanks. So as Dr. Vaughn mentioned, a lot of my background in teaching, it kind of built up and got me to where that's how I got here with thinking about the way curriculum and assessment and instruction interact with each other. So as I moved from the secondary classroom to campus administration and then into research, what I was noticing is that there was a common trend for what should be a standard curriculum and instruction cycle. So what that is probably many of y'all are already aware of, because the way we do program curriculum and assessment is that we start with generally our curriculum, right? Standards, objectives, usually developed by for K-12. That's going to be state systems that will develop what has to be taught, or at higher education, where we have like an English education, we have the National Council for Teachers of English, or other kind of associations that kind of create generally expected standards that lead towards accreditation and what should be done, right? Showing mastery and what it is we're trying to master, right? So we usually starts with a set skills that we want to focus on. And the idea is that that's going to relate to how that is assessed for that accreditation, for meeting those standards, whatever we're looking at there, with instruction kind of bridging the gap, right? That we know we have these standards that we have to achieve, and an assessment that has to show mastery, and like, how are we going to get there? So with instructors at all different levels looking at, right, how do we balance those two? And it should be something where the cycle is kind of perpetual, right? That we know what our standards are and we know how they're going to be assessed. So we take the assessments and what was there, and we use that to develop further curriculum standards, which will then use to tweak our instruction. And it's recursive, right? Continually moving process of what's there. As my friend Toby pointed out the other day, this is something that, depending on the system we're talking about, that cycle can be a really long one, where we're talking about something over the course of years, as in the case for higher education. Accreditation is usually a years long process. But most of my experience is actually within K-12 education, where those cycles happen much faster. Standardized tests usually being yearly, and then benchmark tests happening as frequently as every 3 weeks. So where you're looking at that perpetual move and change of what's there. And what I noticed as I started to look into how this system functions is that this is kind of the ideal of what we want, but it never actually works out that way. And that what we end up with actually looks more like this. James Popham has a great quote. He called it assessment is wagging the curricular dog, where what's happening with standardized assessments is that those have become such an area of importance that everything else, the curriculum and the instruction, has kind of been subsumed by what the assessment requires. So, based on the assessment, curricular standards get prioritized based on only what would be assessed versus things that maybe students still should need. So when you look at what those standards might be, um, and in the case of my study, looking at adolescent literacy, teaching English at junior high and high school levels with what's typically taught, one of the things that my participants specifically noted is that certain genres are completely ignored because they're not assessed. So, full novels were not ever taught because you couldn't teach a novel within that 3 week curricular time frame to get it moved through. Um, Plays or other dramas were usually not really taught simply because they weren't assessed, right? Not like everyone loves plays, but they weren't taught because it wasn't on the assessment. They knew they weren't going to see it. So the specific curriculum became targeted based on what the assessment was. So instead of focusing on the standards and things that as expert instructors, that we would say these are things that students should know in that field, that no longer became important. And only what was important was the assessment itself. And that kind of, right? And again, with instruction being what's supposed to bridge that gap, instruction started to look like test specific instruction. So rather than teaching critical thinking skills, rather than teaching inquiry process, usually it was an issue of teaching specifically how to address things in the way, shape, and form that it would look like on the assessment, right? So very, very test specific in what that looks like. So when I left the classroom, when I left the campus, um, it was because I was noticing that this disparity was happening with the way curriculum and assessment, the way it functions versus the way it's supposed to function. And I kind of wanted to look at, why that is, because this doesn't, um, it's not cohesive with my experience of what students need. And even the curriculum and instruction and assessment cycle is even still pretty simplistic for what students actually need. Because when you consider what all is going on in a school system, there's never just the curriculum and instruction and assessment. Um, it's a myriad of things mixing and bumping, and sometimes things are more important than others. Um, Having worked with junior high students, um, and recognizing just the mental and hormonal and physical growth that those seventh and eighth graders were dealing with, sometimes you were going to have a high emotion day, and whatever the other things that you were dealing with, you needed to consider what all was going on with that student, right? So um, I wanted to look and see if there was something that allowed for this variety of things that interact that actually affect the way curriculum and instruction function in a school system. And it led me eventually to the ideas of complexity theories and complexity adaptive theories. Okay, the ideas behind complexity is simply that things are not linear. We like to talk about them in a linear way. It's very easy to talk about things in a linear way. Recognizing the relationship between curriculum and instruction and assessment um, as like a step by step process is very helpful, right? When you can think of it as a 1, 2, 3 process. But the reality is it doesn't. It's not a 1, 2, 3 process. There's all these other things involved. Um, right, who your students are, the cultures that they're bringing to the classroom, the books that you're trying to read, the content you're trying to assess, the policies, either state or national, that direct what you are and are not allowed to teach, the way those things are assessed, even when looking at some content areas that are not assessed, and then recognizing, like, does that mean they're not important? So where all of those pieces are going to look, um, and what can we do to kind of interact with, bring all of this together? And within a complex adaptive system, it actually fits very closely to what my experiences showed, right? That you have really this kind of crazy mess of different agents. Okay, so all the people involved within the system, those can be, I say people because that's what I focus on, but policies, books, what the building looks like, right? All of those things that are involved, kind of bumping into each other and interacting and changing the way things function from day to day. So, where you have those interactions that are happening, it creates a pattern, so that it's not that these interactions have never happened before. Okay, that we're not talking about chaos. Although, again, I have worked at a junior high, so chaos tended to go high. But recognizing that, right, these different agents, right, the different influences are rubbing up against each other, putting pressure on each other, creating tensions back and forth between each other to create system wide patterns, so that certain things are going to affect change. And when those patterns happen again and again, when you have certain patterns, they kind of become reified. And as they do, it starts to affect future interactions between the agents involved. Okay, that we have this mutual back and forth between how the agents are interacting with each other and the patterns that are influencing how they interact with each other. But it's something that's emergent. Okay, every day you're going to end up with something slightly different than what you had the day before. The patterns might be similar, and the way things function can follow a pretty consistent understanding, but those differences, change. With my favorite example is in my classroom, and you have that one student. Okay, what happens when that one student isn't there today? That one little thing is changed, and now, right, the interactions and ways of that system, my classroom system, has completely changed. Okay, because the way they're interacting will completely change. The patterns are there, right? I mean, I'm still teaching, right? I'm running the classroom management is there, the policies are there, but the the emergent way that we're going to interact will change. So little things like that can always cause things. The idea behind it is that it's perpetually in motion, right? That these are fluid changes that happen consistently, right? Always functioning, and they're not linear. There's not. one thing really that I can say this is always going to function this way, or these are the particular agents that we have to get the system to work in a certain way. That's just a perpetually changing system. Okay, now that brings us to the problem of how do we deal with this level of chaos that's happening, if it is always emerging, if it's always growing, it's always changing. How do we organize that? And as educators, apply some kind of structure to it in a way that will let us um, be supportive and effective for our students, right? Like, I mean, if you have a chaotic place, it doesn't always work well. Um, and a lot of the things that I go to is a system called adaptive action, which fortunately is way easier to wrap your brain around than complexity, because it's three very simple questions. You're wanting to know what is going on right now. Okay, just who is here, what's happening. Okay, like what's happening in this system right now. Once you know what is going on, then you need to ask yourself, so what does it mean that these things are happening? And once you can get an idea of this is what's happening and this is why that is important, right? That it's bringing tension to bear, then we need to talk about now what do we do about it? Okay, so that within those systems, we can affect change. We can start kind of shaping those patterns by thinking about what all's involved, which ones are important, and what we are going to do to influence those patterns in a way that, as educators, we want to be more supportive for our students, and looking at how those pieces will come together. So, what that creates, right, when we consider all of these tensions, is a learning landscape. All right, and this is one that um, takes a very linear approach, and it softens that idea of linearity. So with this case, if we think about standards or problems that we want to um, impart to our students, what that's going to look like is it's going to move across this landscape in a very natural type of way. And in terms of content areas, you have things that are, as you can see on the bottom left, very, very stable. Okay, things that are very stable have a very strong certainty, and have a very strong agreement. So if we were talking about something like a mathematics issue, um, 4 plus 5 is going to always equal 9, right? Like that's pretty certain. Most people will agree, right? You're going to get a stable response. Um, and we also have, right, when we're talking about things that are stable, we also end up with things that are like, well, that's wrong, right? Like, so if somebody said 5 plus 4 is 13, he'd be like, no, right? No, it's like that. It's not, right? Like, absolutely not. So that stable piece is there. When you move to the farther right, in the top right corner, where you get things that are unstable, that's where we end up with things that are much more chaotic. So if we're talking again in the field of mathematics, the way fractals function, the way I had a picture of the galaxy up on the front page, because the way that, right, those things spiral out but still maintain connection, um, right, that is our chaos. Okay, so that when we're talking about things and how that's going to function, and emergent is kind of where you want things to be, right? You want them to always be tending towards the middle. So there are stable pieces of information that we need to be giving to our students, right? The 5 plus 9 is not, 5 plus 4 is 9. 2 plus 2 is always going to be 4, right? Like we have some consistency there, that kind of grounds us within our fields. But if we are only in that area, if we're only doing the things that are standardized, we leave out the ability to create, right? The ability to inquire. If we're talking again about mathematics, when bringing in things like algorithms or any of those sorts of fractals, which I mentioned, any of that sort of stuff is more towards unstable. And we need to understand that as we're teaching, it's a little bit of both, that we're including those things all together, and it creates a way for students to have emergent learning. They have that strong enough foundation, but they also have uh, unstable. And so as teachers, when we're thinking about those patterns, that stable learning is where we have very tightly constrained, right, strongly bounded systems. Okay, that they're not allowing um, anything else. Right, we have this very standardized, specific approach to the way that's going to learn. Whereas when things are unstable, those constraints aren't there at all. Okay, it is the free for all. This is when we are approaching chaos. Nothing's necessarily connected, um, and you lose the ability to have things that are correct. Right, once you kind of move out into that area. But again, what we're looking for are those tensions to be in balance. That it's constrained with um, what information should be there. It's constrained enough to not be chaotic, but free enough that it allows for creativity of thought, inquiry, um, things that would be more along the lines of subjective learning, things that attend towards beauty. All of those pieces will connect more um, when we have them in balance. So I use this framework to address a lot of the work that I was doing to see where that would put our school systems, right? Like recognizing that I want to find, like on average, that they're in that middle kind of sweet spot of emergent learning. So for my study, right, I did focus on junior high, eighth grade English students. And I looked at a specific school district system where it was actually in stages. So we had the classroom level system, the campus level system, and the district level system. Okay, the idea very much like stacking, right? The stacking dolls, that they're similar but not exactly the same, right? They're all just going to be functioning at a different level. And looking at really what was happening, the way that these different systems functioned with curriculum instruction and assessment. So I worked with these three educators over the course of about a year, and interviewed them over the work that they were doing, and kind of got an idea about what themes that they were bringing up in terms of how this piece functioned. And what I found um, were some three basic, right, three basic kind of ideas that um, all three levels, the teacher, the administrator, and the district coordinator approached learning like a business, right? That there was a lot of compliance requirement. There was a lot of focus on production and quality control. A lot of the terminologies that they used in their everyday conversation um, mirrored what you would see in terms of business strategies, and a lot of that is talked about in with like kind of these neoliberal ideals um, were coming out into practice on that front. Um, Also, because they focus so heavily on assessments, that their ideas of curriculum were narrowed down specifically to products. So instead of focusing on particular skills or content that students would need to know, They focused instead on um, when I asked them about curriculum, they talked about a curriculum package that the district had purchased for everyone to use. So they weren't talking about standards necessarily. They were mostly talking about this package system and how that would be implemented for, again, compliance and production and quality control based, again, what was happening with that product. Built into it because it was a state created product that aligned with the state created test. They did focus a lot also on how we were preparing students specifically for taking that test. Um, the Some of the research that I looked at called that being test wise, which means that instead of teaching the content area, right, that math teachers and history teachers and English teachers were not teaching our content area so much as we were teaching how to take that test, right? Like the test itself had become a content area. Um, and then when we talked about what successful learning or teaching looked like, those both circled around how well students did on those standardized tests. So students were only successful if they passed those tests, right? As a secondary, like, well, maybe they talked about students might have improved on the test, but it was really a focus on if they were able to pass the test or not. Teachers in kind were determined to be successful if their students passed the test. So that we had, when I talked to the district director about um, training that might happen and how that support could be, um, right, content, curricular support could happen, she specifically noted that we're trying to get uh, kind of teacher pairs, teacher leaders to get involved with it, and that they were kind of bottlenecked by trying to find specifically teachers who could be successful by having high numbers of students pass the test, which um, at the time she was saying that was particularly difficult because teachers who had high numbers of students pass one year maybe had slightly less pass another year, right? And it was never particularly consistent, um, because, at least from my point of view, every year you have a different set of students, you have a different set of texts, right? All those little things change. um, and that they had a stalemate there about what they were going to decide was a successful teacher, based on those things. And while this did track with my expectations of assessment having kind of this overblown level of importance, it it shocked me at the time for exactly how pervasive this was. That not only was assessment driving curriculum and instruction, but it was becoming like the everything that they did at all of these different levels, and it was creating a very wide, um, a very narrow approach to standardization. When you look at that learning landscape again, right? So I took all of those things and um, those different themes that came out of the data and applied them to this. And what I found is that within a learning system, all of those constraints were becoming very tight, that everything was becoming extremely standardized, and the district was actively, the campus administrator and the district coordinator were both actively trying to make those tighter, right? Recognizing that we were going to get more towards standardization, more towards a specific, I guess, objective way of understanding what those curriculum pieces would be, at the expense of things on a looser constraint where we would have that inquiry and, right, creativity. A lot of the things were being switched out, right? That if we have those things in play, the tension, they were making choices to create patterns that constrained what students and teachers were able to do, in such a way that it moved away from, right, what was emergent, and they moved away from what was generative. And recognizing that we have some well established understandings about learning, Bloom's hierarchy, where you have, right, the analytical, the creative, the evaluative being up at a higher level of understanding. um, those are being moved away for those more stable pieces that were standardized. um, and that goes against a large body of research talking about 21st century skills, critical reading, right? Understanding and inquiry, having an inquiry focus for learning. It moves away from a lot of that specific to make sure that we can keep things standardized, in their system. So again, that gets it gets a lot, right? There's all these moving pieces that are happening in a complex system. So looking at it in a way that, let's just say, okay, what's going on, right? So what, now what? Is that those themes that emerged are what was happening. Okay. They are approaching it like a business. They are narrowly defining what curriculum is. They are narrowly defining what standardization is, and what success would be for learning. And the reason that's important, right? The so what of that is that it was actively leaving out issues of creativity, culture, and individuality. With in our K-12 schools, was perpetuating kind of the status quo, of, we talk the achievement gap, the opportunity gap of students who aren't necessarily as prepared to deal with that one function of assessment are going to continue to not do well because they fall outside of the constraints that the school system was willing to deal with. So recognizing that that's clearly an important problem, right? Like we're seeing that it does have some serious repercussions. Looking at it and saying that what can we do about it from within those systems? Um, the first step would be to recognize that it's just a test, right? That to lower, the high stakes nature of the assessments that we give to students, um, and recognizing that, like, that is, it's simply an assessment. It's just a test. The function of it should be to hone our curriculum and better our instruction, right? When we go back to that cycle of how assessment is supposed to be used, the way we want to think about it being used, um, and to get back there, we would need to reduce those, the punitive nature of assessments, and, moving away from that as a standardized issue would be to increase assessments, that allow for, inquiry focus, and increase assessments that allow for, portfolio type work, so that students can bring their individual creativity, they can bring creative thought, into the skills that we are trying to teach them as they go through and develop. That's what I have. What questions might y'all have?
Brilliant work, Tiffany. Just, obviously we're in the same field. I'd like to look at it from the perspective of higher ed. So if assessment wags the curriculum dog, in K-12, I would argue in my experience doing assessment in this department and at the liberal arts college level, that assessment matters not at all. So very rarely do we look at the data, and we don't really share that out. And I'm looking at myself because I was assessment coordinator for many years. And so we have like these portfolios that our undergrads do, and I don't ever see that data then informing, curriculum and instruction. I could be wrong. So my question to you is, what if we live in that looser constraints area? How does that then, work with your what, so what, now what?
So if we move more towards, you don't want to go so far out into chaos, right? We don't want to be a system where everyone's running around just doing whatever they want to do, um, right? And that level, it becomes difficult to function as an organization, right? Like the systems, it doesn't hold. So you can't go that far out into it. But if we can bring it back towards the middle, where things are more emergent and more generative, um, I think what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to use the data that we collect on the assessment side of things to actually move us forward. So I don't know much, being new to UCO, about the way assessment is used here. But based on what you were saying, my guess would be that we're doing the assessments for the sake of doing the assessments, that the assessments are there because someone told us we had to do it, that there is some higher body, whether that is the accreditation bodies, which would probably be my guess, right, in terms of university accreditation, program accreditation, are telling us that we have to do these assessments. So we collect all that stuff, we did the assessment, and we send it to them because there's high stakes connected to it, but it's not actually being used to help with what we teach or how we teach it. So if that's being the case, it sounds like we're not, the system is slower, right? So with K-12, in this particular school, they were doing assessments every 3 weeks. Like, I mean, it was mad dash how often they had to do things. They literally didn't have time to apply it. So with the higher ed, over longer periods of time, there might be time to actually look at what's going on there in terms of, now what can we do in terms of tweaking what our curriculum looks like, and in terms of how we teach that to our students. So an easy what if would be, we have these standards for our program, right? That we want to make sure we've hit those standards for our programs, but is there more, right? Is there something that our students need to know that maybe isn't covered in the standards? Like it might not be something that wouldn't necessarily be on that bottom stable part of the skill set, but is something that they maybe still should be aware of before we graduate them and send them out to the world. So is that something we should include in our curriculum? Right? And then would that help our overall assessment of student success? Right? So part of that could also be, are we going to count success as meeting standards and accreditation? Are we going to count it as having students who are able to graduate? Are we going to count it as students who are able to go adult in their chosen field? Right? Like what, right? And recognizing that those tensions have to find a middle ground, I would say we probably need to deal with all three.
Is everything worthwhile that we do accessible? Or I've been thinking a lot about the difference between outcomes and practice. Like you think of like a yoga practice, or like, standards as like, okay, you hit this standard, you're fine, you're good to go, like we're done with you. Like if you were going to just measure outcomes for like how much weight somebody could lift, and if somebody can come in and lift 25 pounds, you say like, okay, good, you don't need to exercise anymore. Like you've hit the level, or is anything we do? I mean, I feel the answer is yes. Like it maybe, especially in the humanities, about like reading and thinking as a practice, and it doesn't matter what you're reading and whether like it's less about like what you can do, but that you have done it.
I think the issue in that case is going to depend on a couple of approaches. So if we're considering learning along the lines of, well, have you read this classic canon text, right? And if you have, then we declare you as learned, right? Or is it something where we want our students to have a particular skill where they can grapple with a literary text and then apply it later? If you're approaching it on that second front as a skill, which I do, so I'm gonna go that way, then it becomes a matter of being growth minds, right? Of applying with a growth mindset that we have done this practice, you have done it once, and it has been, I'm going to say passable, but we normally talk about that and with like a negative connotation, but like you've done it, right? But if you continue to do those things, you will continue to get better, right? You'll be able to think about things in a new light and apply it to different situations, and those sorts of things. And then it becomes an issue of we're not necessarily assessing. This is where a portfolio approach would come in, that we were able to see like they are moving in the right direction, right, towards building those skills. And we're not necessarily hitting a arbitrary grade mark where we say, oh, nope, they've got it, right? They're all done learning.
So I have a comment more than a question. But what you made me think of is as my oldest daughter is moving through high school, I have started to realize that even though she is in some of the higher level English classes, that they are beating the love of reading out of her. And it is horrifying to me. And what they're doing is they are teaching to that AP test, the be all and end all, everything for that. And so as a parent and a professor, I'm looking at this thinking, what can I do? You're killing all of her creativity. You're killing all of her individuality. And so I'm trying to think of ways to prevent that, because for her on an individual level, but I also think of all the people, all the students in high school who will never want to major in English because it is a hellish place of 7 highlighter pens, and I'm not kidding, going through the text, identifying all of these tiny bits and pieces as they go through high school because they're teaching to that test, as opposed to enjoying literature and seeing the creativity within it. So I guess I have this comment, but I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to deal with that on an individual level for my own children. And also when I think about our declining majors, no wonder they don't want to come. I mean, I would not be an English major the way that they are teaching it in high school. So
as a mom to a teenager, like I have had that situation, and I have had to go and talk to my child's teacher, who wanted to only do test preparation. Like, is one of these teachers, like wasn't even trying to hide it. Like, it was just, we're not reading anything. Here's your test. We're going to just do a bunch of these. And I went in and very nicely and very sternly said, no, we are not doing that. And I brought her a lot of the information, and that was extra fun because my daughter went to the school district where I was doing my dissertation work. This was during the year that I was pulling that data from. So like, I had all the articles, like, I will come at you. We have all of this information about that's not right. Like, not only is that not good for them, it's actively bad for them. And that one teacher excused my daughter from that, but she maintained it for the rest of the class. So when we look at it, and I think we have to approach it, that's where the adaptive action comes in, that we can say, okay, we know this is a thing that's happening. We can agree on the so what, like why this might be a problem. So what do we want to do about it? And our roles, right? So as academics, one of our roles is to put out current research that supports best practice in our fields, right? As teachers, it's to support that next generation to know what's there, right? So that we're tweaking those changes we can make in the individual roles that we have now. And that seems small until you recognize that everyone has a different role in a different situation, right? That I am a researcher, I am a teacher, I am a teacher educator, right? I'm a mom. Like all of those things come through, and in those different structures, right, that I can come in and apply pressure to knock those patterns in a different way. Does that make sense? People, because we still have to deal with issues of power dynamics, those who have power within systems will have a greater ability to shape those patterns. So talking to, right, like on one hand, I can just tell my daughter, like, it doesn't matter, like, we don't, right, just go along. But as the student, she has the absolute least amount of power. So, right, bring this up to, right, her teacher, bring this up to the campus administrator, right, go to a school board meeting, right? Like it's one of those things that once we know better, do better, right? And as that system is moving, right, they have these heavy influences, usually because of policy and state requirements for how they're going to define learning at the K-12 level specifically, and bring that to bear so that we can start making those changes before it becomes completely locked down. Because once it's in a, right, like it's a rut, right? And one of the things that I was starting to question is a lot of these policies that have been in place for about 25 to 30 years. So teachers who are just now going into school systems have literally never known anything else, right? That's what they know. And I think you're right. I think we're going to get teachers who, I had one teacher candidate a few years ago who wanted to be a high school English teacher actively tell me she doesn't read books, she doesn't like books, and she didn't expect that her students would read books. And she looked at me like I was a crazy person when I told her that might slow down her ability to be an English teacher, right? Because she was just like, you don't read books in English class. I mean, it just, so we are having, right, we're seeing what that's looking like as the systems become more constrained, and thinking about what can we in our individual roles within this complex systems do to push back. The good news is you can do a lot in your different roles.
I think it starts with knowing the impact that like the state superintendent of education in a state has, because in our state, our current state superintendent really did away with a lot of those tests. And I think it freed a lot of students to enjoy reading more. If you look at data, this younger generation is reading a lot. They are book lovers. They read all types of books, right? And so then we have something like House Bill, 1775 that comes down to quash that. And so really being active political agents and knowing what happens in, public ed is so vital.
Agreed. Because, and a lot of it can be, like I said, we as researchers, right, and experts in our field have more authority than most. and we can use that. But everyone, most everyone can register to vote and go vote, right? Everyone can attend a school board meeting, right? That you have like all of the players within that system. We have the ability, right, to create tension that will affect the patterns we create going forward. So we want to make sure that's right. I'm bringing my cheery disposition and positive outlook. We have the ability to change it. We like, if this is where we are, it doesn't mean we have to stay there. We can push and move to make changes within the systems where we find ourselves.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. I like that idea very, very much. And thank you for your presentation. But I do know that one of the things that bothered me so much when I was in my secondary career was the fact that funding was tied to the assessment. And so when you've got a school system, particularly from the College Board, the AP program, funding for supplies in the classroom, all that is tied to scores on the AP exam. And that really complicates everything. So your notion about the complex systems and what the role of the university can play in training the teachers, even providing additional support in training. I mean, if we were to use assessment in the way that we know to use assessment, and then say, this is how this works for us, and be able to, whether it's through workshops or even through conversations with our children's teachers or our friends who are still teachers in the secondary classrooms, particularly in English Ed is where we see a lot of that coming into play so much. But I just, like you said, and then one of the questions I was going to ask, but then you went ahead and addressed it in your presentation. There's a tremendous body of research out there that supports, I mean, what's happening right now, why it doesn't work. We already know this, that this stimulating critical thinking is what's got to happen if we really want to do well as a society and move forward. So I'm sorry there's not a really good question in there, because you've answered all of them, but it was just a really, I like the idea that it's complex systems and that what higher ed can do. Okay, I'm done.
What I'm hearing, or the question you might be moving towards, is if we know better, right? Like if we have all of this research that says this isn't a great idea, if we have all this research that says critical thinking is important for 21st century skills, right? Like we know all of those things.
Right.
Why aren't we doing it?
Right.
I don't know, but I have a strong guess because it's harder. It is so much easier to create a multiple choice test. It is so much easier to create those stable questions than it is to create an assessment that allows for creativity, right? So if we want to talk about, those more complex issues, moving more towards chaos, how are we going to define beauty suddenly becomes a really difficult assessment versus, what was the name of the author of the story we read is suddenly much, much easier. I know funding is tied to that for the simple, right? If we had teachers with more reasonable workloads, who were dealing with a more reasonable number of students, where they could assess the more complex portfolio things, right? Where we do have more writing and creative assessments that are there, that teachers could assess those. But my last year at the high school, I had 187 students. And the year before that, I had 218. So being able to actually assess them on those complex things wasn't possible because there was not time. Right. So where the funding comes in to say, right, we do need that funding. That's part of it. And the funding is tied to it. So we end up with kind of this slippery slope of we're not funding it, so teachers have to bring it more towards a stable assessment, and then we're going to then only fund them on how they do on those stable assessments, and it perpetuates. And I think that's how we've gotten to where we are now. And I know Laura talked about the benefit from our state superintendent in Oklahoma. My research was done in Texas, where before No Child Left Behind was a thing, we had that version Texas style before it became national. So like literally generations of students, right? We've got about 45 years in Texas where this has been building.
I just wanted to say, Tiffany, how much I enjoyed that. I'm not, I mean, I know something about assessment. It's not my favorite topic, but you made it really interesting and brought up a lot of important points that spawned that conversation. I have a senior in high school right now, and
Right in
so
the thick of
things
it.
I'm thinking about in terms of
Mhm.
you know her own education. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Tiffany. I'm sorry I was not able to hear all of your remarks, but I was very, very impressed with the conversation that you inspired. To me, that's always the test of a really good presentation or class session. It gets people talking, and we just keep talking. So thank you. And this is so relevant and so important to what we do as the educators of educators and as educators in every dimension. So you've gotten us off to an amazing start, Dr. Larson, for our series this year. But it was great to be able to take this time to learn from you, Dr. Larson, and to learn from one another as we've discussed. I wish you all a great afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Vaughn, for coordinating our new faculty lecture series, one of the things that I think is most exciting in our college. I wish you the very best. Have a great evening, everyone.